What happens when the quietest person in the room suddenly opens up and shares their deepest thoughts? This is the story of the moment my nephew's friend, a boy who I barely knew, unexpectedly laid bare his heart. A conversation I never saw coming, but one that stayed with me for years. The kind of raw honesty that can change your perspective on life forever. Intro. Before I begin, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. So, here we go. It was a lazy summer afternoon, the kind where the world feels soft, like everything's just a little more patient, a little more relaxed. I was sitting on the porch, watching the neighborhood drift by. Kids riding their bikes down the street, the smell of fresh-cut grass hanging in the air, and the warmth of the sun just starting to sink lower, casting everything in that golden, late-afternoon glow. I was there with my nephew, Jake. He was 15, tall for his age, always a bit too quick with a sarcastic comment or a half-formed idea. Typical teenager. That afternoon, he invited his friend, Danny, to hang out. I didn't know Danny that well at the time, but I'd met him a few times, quiet, reserved, always with his head down, like he was trying not to be noticed. I didn't think much of it, just another one of Jake's friends. But looking back, I realized that something about that day, about Danny, was different. Jake and Danny were out back, tossing a football around, and I could hear their voices drifting through the screen door. Laughter. The kind that's easy and effortless when you're young. But then the laughter stopped. And I'm not talking about the usual pause between throws, but a different kind of silence. The kind where you know something's changed in the air. I didn't pay too much attention at first, but then I heard Danny's voice, a little strained, almost hesitant. He was asking Jake a question. "Hey, Jake," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Can I ask you something?" Jake, not missing a beat, tossed the ball over to him. "Sure, man. What's up?" There was a long pause. I couldn't see them, but I could imagine the look on Jake's face. That half smirk, the one that said he thought Danny was going to ask some goofy question. But instead, I heard Danny speak again, his words hanging in the air like they were too big for him to handle. You ever think about, like, the future?" Danny asked. "I mean, what happens after all this? You know, after high school, after we all grow up." I was sitting on the porch, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. That question. It wasn't the sort of thing you expect a 15-year-old to ask, not in that way. It was a question that seemed too serious, too deep for someone still in the middle of figuring out who they were. There was another long pause before Jake responded. "Ah, sure. I guess. Everybody thinks about that stuff, right?" Jake's voice was casual, but I could tell it didn't come easy for him. And Danny, as always, was quieter than usual. "I mean, I don't know," Danny said, almost as if talking to himself. "It just feels like there's so much pressure to figure it all out, you know. I don't even know what I want to do, or who I want to be. And sometimes, I don't even feel like I fit in, you know? Like, no one really gets me." I stopped what I was doing and leaned a little closer to the screen door. I don't know why I was so compelled to listen. Maybe it was because Danny was saying things that seemed too real for his age. Or maybe it was because I knew there was something he was carrying with him, something heavier than what a teenage boy should have to carry alone. And then Danny's voice lowered even more, like he was about to say something he'd never said out loud before. I could almost feel the weight of his words before they even left his mouth. I feel like no one really sees me. I'm not like Jake or the other guys. They know what they want. They're all moving forward, and I'm just stuck." My heart tightened. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, so quietly, so vulnerable. This wasn't the Danny I thought I knew, the boy who barely spoke, who always seemed to be looking for the right moment to slip into the background. This was a side of him I had never seen, and it caught me completely off guard. Jake didn't respond right away. There was something in the air, something between them now, like the moment had become too big for either of them to navigate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake spoke, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. "Danny, it's okay to not have it all figured out. Not everyone has everything sorted. It's not about knowing what you're gonna do, but just figuring it out as you go. It's not a race." The words sounded right. They sounded comforting, but there was something in the way Danny didn't answer that told me Jake's words hadn't landed the way he hoped. They didn't quite reach Danny's heart, not in the way Jake probably intended. And that's when I realized Jake wasn't the only one trying to figure out who he was. Danny was too, and maybe I could be the one to help him with that, even if it was in a small way. I got up from the porch, quietly walked inside, and sat down in the kitchen, where I had a perfect view of the backyard. I didn't want to intrude on their conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening right there. Something that neither of them would fully understand in the moment. I don't know how much time passed, but when I finally stood up again, Danny was sitting on the grass, staring down at his shoes, the football abandoned beside him. I walked out slowly, taking care not to startle him. "Hey," I said, my voice soft. "Everything okay?" Danny looked up at me, his eyes wide, a bit surprised to see me standing there. For a second, he said nothing. But then, just as he was about to look away, I saw something in his expression that made my heart ache. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think so." It wasn't much, but it was something. And that's how I knew. This wasn't just a passing moment. This was the beginning of something. It was just the start. For me, and for Danny, that moment would stick. The next few days passed in a blur of typical summer heat and lazy afternoons. But even as life continued on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, both in Danny and in myself. What he'd said that day had stayed with me, lingering like the scent of jasmine on a warm evening breeze. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the fact that he had shared them at all. I kept wondering if he realized how rare it was for someone to let their guard down like that. Jake and Danny were back to their usual routine, hanging out on the weekends, playing video games, and of course throwing that same old football around in the backyard. But the tension I'd felt that day, subtle, almost imperceptible, was still there, just beneath the surface. Jake didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care to, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And though Danny was quieter than usual, there was a certain openness in the way he carried himself now, a softness I hadn't seen before. One Saturday, about a week after that conversation, I found myself in the kitchen, making a pot of coffee when I heard the back door open. Jake and Danny had just returned from some errand, their voices drifting in from the porch. The sunlight was filtering through the blinds, casting everything in that familiar golden glow. I was stirring the sugar into my cup when Danny stepped into the kitchen. For a moment he didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at the counter, avoiding my gaze. There was a nervous energy in the air, like he was deciding whether or not he should speak. And then, as if he couldn't help himself, he broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was quiet, almost unsure, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I'd even heard him correctly. I set the spoon down and turned to face him, trying to hide the surprise in my expression. "Of course, Danny. What's on your mind?" He shifted on his feet, his hands in his pockets. "It's about that day, a few days ago, when we were talking, about the future and stuff." Ah, so he remembered. I had wondered if he'd forgotten, if it had been nothing more than a fleeting moment for him. But apparently not. I nodded, giving him the space to continue. "What about it?" He hesitated, his brow furrowing as if he was weighing how to phrase it. I don't know. I guess I've been thinking about it more. About what you said. About how it's okay not to have everything figured out. I didn't respond right away, just let him talk. I wanted to give him the room to explore what he was feeling. I don't know if you meant it, but it kind of helped. I mean, it didn't solve everything, but it made me feel like I wasn't crazy for not having all the answers yet. His voice was gaining a little more confidence, but there was still an underlying vulnerability there, something unspoken. I smiled softly, hoping to put him at ease. I meant it, Danny. Honestly, nobody has it all figured out. You don't have to have a roadmap for your whole life right now. He nodded, his gaze finally lifting to meet mine. There was a moment of quiet understanding between us. Then, without any warning, Danny did something I hadn't expected. He sat down at the kitchen table. Do you ever think about how different things could be? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. I mean, what if you didn't take that job, or you didn't meet certain people, or you didn't make certain choices? I guess I'm just wondering what it all means, you know. His question hung in the air like a heavy fog. I could feel his uncertainty, but also a deep curiosity about life, about his own place in it. It reminded me of the times when I'd been his age and felt the same way, unsure about every decision I made, questioning everything and everyone. But unlike him, I had a support system, people to guide me. Danny didn't seem to have that. At least, not in the way he needed. I sat down across from him, not wanting to give him an answer that felt too rehearsed or too easy. You're asking the big questions, Danny, I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. I think everybody does at some point. You start looking back and wonder if you've made the right choices, or if you should have done something different. But the truth is, we don't really get to know, do we? All we can do is keep going. He nodded, absorbing my words. But there was still a trace of something on his face, something unsettled, as if he was waiting for the answers that I, too, had yet to find. We sat there for a few moments in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. I could see the weight of his thoughts pressing on him, even if he wasn't ready to share them completely. Finally, I leaned forward, trying to bridge the gap between us. Danny, I said gently, I don't know what's ahead for you, but you're allowed to take your time. The pressure you feel, it's real, I know, but you're not in a race. You're not behind. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. He didn't respond at first, but I saw something in his eyes, a shift, like a weight lifting just a little. For a moment, I felt like I was reaching him, like he could hear me not just as an adult trying to comfort him, but as someone who understood the kind of uncertainty he was going through. Jake appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. What's going on in here? He asked, glancing between the two of us. Danny looked up at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Nothing, he said softly, but the tension in his shoulders had eased. Just talking. Jake didn't press it further, just shrugged and stepped back out. But before he left, I caught a brief glance between him and Danny, a look that said more than words ever could. And just like that, the conversation faded into the background, but I knew it wasn't really over. Not for Danny. Not for me. The moment had left its mark on both of us, and even if he didn't realize it yet, something had changed. There was a connection between us now, a bond that I hadn't expected, but one that I would carry with me for a long time. As Danny got up to join Jake outside, I watched him for a moment longer. He was still the same boy, of course, quiet, reserved, unsure, but there was something different about him. He wasn't quite as lost as he had been when he first walked through that door. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that it was okay to not have all the answers. For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful for him, for us both. The weeks that followed that conversation felt like they were moving in slow motion, but in a way that made everything feel more meaningful. Every time I saw Danny, there was a little more openness in him, a little more ease in his voice, like he was learning how to be present in the world without feeling like he had to carry the weight of it all on his own shoulders. It was subtle, but I could see it. His shoulders weren't as hunched anymore. His gaze wasn't as downcast. And though he still wasn't the most talkative kid, there was something different in his silences. Like he wasn't hiding anymore. Or at least not as much. Jake, of course, hadn't noticed the change. He was too wrapped up in his usual teenage antics, plans with friends, parties, school projects he was half-heartedly working on. I didn't mind. I loved my nephew. But the truth was, he didn't always understand the things I did, or at least not in the same way. He was too busy living his own life to see what was unfolding with Danny. And that was okay. I didn't need him to see it, but I did. I'd started seeing more of Danny, too. Not in a forced way, more like we'd both fallen into a quiet understanding. Sometimes he popped by just to hang out, or I'd catch him sitting on the porch, reading or playing his guitar. He was an easy person to have around, not demanding, just quietly existing in the same space, letting the day go by. But that day, the day that would become the turning point for both of us, came completely out of the blue. It was a Thursday afternoon, the air still warm from a lingering summer heatwave. I had just returned from running errands and was unloading the car when I saw Danny sitting on the back steps, a strange stillness in his posture. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just staring out at the garden. I didn't want to interrupt him at first, but there was something about the way he was sitting that made me pause. It felt like a moment, like he was waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. I put the groceries down on the kitchen counter and walked out onto the porch, my steps slow and deliberate so I wouldn't startle him. "You okay?" I asked, sitting down beside him. Danny didn't answer right away. He kept looking at the garden, as if the world around him had stopped moving, and it was only him and the gentle rustle of the leaves. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something unsaid between us. Finally he turned to me, his eyes searching mine for something, understanding, maybe, or just a place to let it all out. "Do you ever feel like you're not supposed to be where you are?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like, what if you're supposed to be somewhere else, doing something else, and you're just stuck?" I blinked, taken aback by the suddenness of his words. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, running a hand through his messy hair. "I don't know. Sometimes I just feel like I'm not. I don't belong here, with the people I'm with. Like I'm not really part of this world. It's like everything I do, it doesn't quite fit." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and I could tell this wasn't just a passing thought for him. It was something he'd been wrestling with for a long time. My heart ached for him. For the first time, I felt like I was truly seeing the depth of his struggle, not just the boy who was unsure of his future, but the one who didn't feel like he had a place in the world at all. It was a pain I understood too well. I exhaled slowly, choosing my words carefully. "Danny, I think a lot of people feel that way at some point in their lives, like they don't belong, like they're waiting for something to change. But the truth is, sometimes we don't get to choose when we fit in. Sometimes it's about finding peace with where we are, even when we don't feel ready. And most importantly, it's about knowing that it's okay to feel lost. It doesn't mean you're stuck. It just means you're in the process of figuring things out." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. I knew this wasn't something that could be solved with a few comforting words. It was deeper than that, more complicated. We sat there for a while, the quiet between us stretching out like a calm sea. The sound of the wind through the trees was the only thing filling the space around us. I let him be. I didn't push. There was something sacred about this moment, something that didn't need to be rushed. Finally, Danny spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost like he was confiding in me something that had been locked away for years. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I want. I mean, everybody else seems to have it figured out, but I don't. I don't even know who I'm supposed to be. I felt a pang in my chest. This was the kind of vulnerability that most people would never show, especially not a teenage boy, especially not Danny. I wanted to reach out and say something that would make it all better, something that would give him the answers he was looking for, but I knew that wasn't possible. The only thing I could do was let him speak, let him pour out whatever he needed to say. "You're not supposed to have it all figured out yet," I said softly, my voice firm but gentle. "None of us do, but you will. In time you will. Just don't be so hard on yourself, okay?" He didn't say anything for a long time, and I thought he might walk away, maybe retreat back into himself. But then something shifted. I saw it in his eyes, a flicker of something, a kind of understanding, even if he wasn't ready to fully accept it. He looked at me, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. "I don't know if I believe that," he said, "but I think maybe I want to." And just like that, I knew it wasn't about fixing anything. It wasn't about providing the answers. It was about showing him that there was space for him to grow, to become whatever he needed to be. There's something about these moments that stay with you. Sometimes the things we need most aren't grand gestures or answers that solve everything. They are the small, quiet moments of connection that help us realize we're not alone. And that's exactly what I saw in Danny that day. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And neither was I. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I could see him sitting there, still lost in thought, but somehow a little lighter than before. Maybe he hadn't figured it all out yet, but for the first time, I believed he was on his way. The days that followed felt quieter, softer, like the world had taken a breath, and we were all in sync, moving forward at our own pace, but not alone. Danny started showing up more often, hanging around the house, playing guitar on the porch, reading books in the corner of the yard. It wasn't that he was seeking anything from me. It was more like he was trying to find his own space, his own rhythm, and for some reason, he felt safe doing it here, with me. I didn't push him. I didn't try to guide him or ask more questions. I simply let him be. And that, I think, was the most important thing I could do. Jake had noticed the change in Danny, though in his typical teenage fashion, he didn't really talk about it. He just nodded at his friend in that way that said everything had always been fine between them. I suppose that's the way it goes when you're young. You don't always have to talk about things to know that something's different, that something's been quietly understood. I could see it in the way Jake looked at Danny sometimes, less like a friend, and more like someone who was figuring things out just like he was. They had that in common now. One evening, about a month after our conversation on the porch, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the sound of an old fan humming in the corner. I had just finished a book I'd been meaning to get through for weeks, and I was feeling that soft content exhaustion that comes from being fully absorbed in something. But before I could get too comfortable, there was a knock on the door. Not the loud, boisterous kind you get from teenagers. This was softer, hesitant. I stood up and opened it, and there stood Danny, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets, looking like he wasn't sure if he should be there. "Hey," I said, stepping back to let him in. "Everything all right?" He nodded, but there was something different in his eyes. Something I hadn't seen before, a sort of quiet determination. I was wondering if we could talk, about stuff. I smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through me. "Of course, Danny. You can always talk to me." He stepped in, a little awkwardly, and I motioned toward the living room. "Want something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" He shook his head. "No, I'm good, thanks." We sat down on the couch, the silence between us comfortable now. No more weight to it. It wasn't like before when there had been this unspoken pressure hanging in the air. We were just two people sitting together, and I could feel that the space we were sharing was real, not forced. After a few moments, Danny spoke again, this time with a little more confidence in his voice. "I think I've been avoiding some things," he started, looking at his hands. "Not just with you, but with everyone, really. And I'm starting to realize that I've been too afraid to really figure out who I am. Like, I keep waiting for the world to tell me, or for things to just fall into place. But it doesn't work like that, does it?" I shook my head, trying not to rush him. "No, it doesn't. It takes time. But you're doing the right thing by figuring it out on your own. It's hard, I know, but it's part of growing." Danny's eyes met mine, and I could see the clarity starting to break through. There was still uncertainty there, still some of that teenage hesitation. But there was also something else. Hope, maybe. A quiet belief that he could move forward. "You were right, you know," he said softly, "about not needing all the answers. I don't have them, but I think I'm okay with that. For now, at least." I smiled, the same feeling of warmth flooding through me. It wasn't about him figuring everything out in one moment. It was about him letting go of the idea that he had to have it all figured out. And that, I think, was the biggest step. "You're more than okay," I said, my voice steady. "You're exactly where you need to be. And you're growing, even when you don't see it. It's the little steps that matter." He nodded, sitting back on the couch and letting out a breath. It was like a weight had been lifted off his chest, just by saying those words out loud. I could see the relief in his shoulders, in the way his posture had shifted. He wasn't carrying the same heavy burden he had before. "I don't know what's next for me," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "but I know it's not about trying to be someone else anymore. I'm not perfect. I don't have everything figured out, but I think I'm starting to understand that it's okay to just be who I am, to grow into who I'm supposed to be." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. It wasn't an easy realization. Hell, it had taken me years to figure it out for myself. But Danny was ahead of the curve, and I felt so proud of him in that moment, prouder than I'd ever thought I could feel for someone I wasn't related to by blood. This was what it meant to truly grow, to stop hiding, to stop waiting for permission to exist. "Good for you, Danny," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's all anyone can ask for. Just don't rush it. Take your time. You've got all the time you need." We sat there for a while, just in that quiet space, each of us reflecting on the weight of what had just been shared. I didn't know what the future held for him. I didn't know if he was going to have all the answers tomorrow or next year. But in that moment, I felt certain that he was on the right path, that we all are, even when we don't see it clearly. Eventually, Danny stood up, looking at me with a quiet smile. "Thanks, really," he said. "I needed this." I stood up too, my heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Anytime, Danny, anytime." As he walked toward the door, I watched him leave, my mind wandering over everything that had happened in the past few months. It had started with one simple conversation on the porch, but what had blossomed from that moment was something I couldn't have anticipated, something more beautiful, more meaningful than I ever imagined. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew that both Danny and I had learned something valuable from each other. Sometimes it's not the big moments or the grand gestures that change our lives. It's the quiet, unexpected ones. The ones that happen when we're not looking, when we let our guard down, and let someone see the real us. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. It was enough for Danny, and it was enough for me. Don't forget to give us like and subscribe this channel.